You've been hearing a lot about genomics, but there just seems to be a lot of talking about it. I'm going to talk to you about how you can use it to in your breeding program. We have a lot of leading breeders in here. You're looking for that last little extra bit to get out of your breeding program. So first of all, what we're going to do is hopefully you're not sucking down coffee and looking at your watch already like this bloke, but what we're going to do is I'll talk to you about the power of pedigree, the power of measuring traits, and then we'll delve into the genotyping. So a sound breeding program design, you know that you need a correct and full pedigree, some well-managed groupings. You need to be measuring traits in your breeding objective with a high selection intensity. So a lot of what Luke covered yesterday. And these reminders are good, but this probably isn't news to a lot of you people. So let's run over some quick basics before we delve into those genotyping strategies. So I did some simulations to estimate the power of pedigree and phenotyping and genotyping, and I used the MP plus index, but the principles still apply, so you maternal and terminal people don't drift off just yet. And in this, I'm assuming there are correct groupings, so there's no noise, and assuming that there's 100% selection efficiency. So it's in a closed nucleus, and we're selecting the best rams based on breeding values and the best ewes, and they're randomly mated. So I had 5 scenarios. The first scenario is just some basic measurements, so yearling weight, yearling fibre diameter, yearling greasy fleece weight, without any pedigree. In the second scenario, we added in some adult measurements, but still no pedigree. The third one, we added in a sire, we assigned a sire. The fourth one was full pedigree, which meant that we also got the number of lambs weaned trait, and which has a significant weighting in the MP plus index. And finally, genotyping, all of that plus genotyping 20% of the ram selection candidates. And we'll go into more depth about how we came about that 20% after this. So what we have here is a whole table of zeros and ones, and basically where there's zeros, the trait wasn't measured, and where the trait was measured to 1. But just remember the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And basically what we can see is, I've got a shaky hand. Yeah, be no good on a rifle. Even if we're just taking basic measurements with fairly heritable traits, we can still get some gain here. If we add in the trait, add in some adult measured traits, we get a little bit more response. But when we start assigning sire pedigree and full pedigree, we can see that we're starting to get much more significant gain. So if we compare scenario 4 with scenario 3, so 3 is just sire pedigree, 4 is a full pedigree which includes number of lambs weaned, we can see that we can significantly start to increase our rates of genetic gain. And we're seeing that there's that power of the maternal information, as Luke was touching on yesterday, but more so you're picking up that number of lambs weaned trait. And we can also see in the second last column the selection accuracy, the index of the selection candidates is increasing. So we're getting more accurate breeding values, which means it drives our genetic gain. And we can see that the generation interval is also starting to go down. So when we use our genomic selection, we're putting the cream, getting the cream on top, which is where a lot of you people, I'd imagine, the leading breeders will be. So what happens here is we're getting more accurate information on younger selection candidates, so we're making more accurate selection decisions on our younger animals. So basically, we're getting slightly less selection accuracy, but we're starting to really see that decrease in generation interval. So that's the basics of the power of measuring pedigree. I'm going to now delve into the genomic selection part. So just a quick refresher, we've been hearing about it. We're getting most benefit for those late in life, hard to measure, sex-limited, low heritability traits. And there's less of a benefit for those early in life, easy to measure, high heritability traits. So people like using the Carcass Plus index where most of the measurements are made before selection. There's not a whole lot of benefit for genomic selection, but as we incorporate those eating quality traits which are hard to measure, we start to see a real benefit. And one way to have another look at this, Daniel had a slide on it yesterday. This is another way to look at it. So yesterday Daniel had a slide he had a straight line of ASBVs without genomics, and when he did add genomics, they sort of all globbled up because we're able to get more information. So what this slide shows is, we've got the frequency and the ASBV. So we'll just say that 0, and this is really good, and this is no good. And we can see there that without genomics, without that extra information, it's a very narrow bell curve there. Whereas with genomics, we start to see all this variation. And that's important because with variation, we can make genetic gain. So let's pretend we need to select some rams, and you select the best ones. Well, without genomics, my superior size all the way back here, whereas if you're selecting rams with that extra information, then there's room to make much more genetic gain. So that's why genomics are important, particularly in these hard to measure traits. And that's why it's exciting. Because you can see, I mean, this is just visual, but the principle applies. So they're your RAM team cutoffs, and you can see that with genomics you can make all that extra gain in those hard to measure traits. So how can you lead breeders extract that last bit of potential using genomic selection without ending up with cobwebs and moths coming out of your wallet? I did some more simulations, and this time I just used a simple 2-trait index, and I used the genetic covariances for post-weaning weight and IMF. So remembering that if we're just selecting on post-weaning weight, lean meat yield increases, IMF decreases. So basically we can treat this as post-weaning weight as all the traits that you normally measure, and then IMF as all the traits that don't get measured in the eating quality index. So in these simulations we only measured post-weaning weight, and in this particular index they had equal weighting in the breeding objective. So while this is more of a meat quality, merino breeders pay attention still because these principles will apply to merinos as well. So we had 5 scenarios, but we'll just start with 2 to begin with. So the first 2 were, we did some genomic testing on ram candidates prior to the post-weaning measurement. So basically, we sorted the best selection candidates based on parent average, and then we genotyped a proportion of those, ranging from 0% right through to genotyping all of them. Secondly, we did a genomic test and we sorted the ram candidates on the post-weaning measurement. So we sorted them on ASBVs, which included that measurement. So we genomic tested yearlings, and we're assuming that we did 18-month-old first matings. So what we have here on the y-axis is annual genetic gain, and on the x-axis is proportion of selection candidates genotype. So if you genotyped 100% of them, you got 100% of the benefit. And what we can see here, and then 0 is obviously you didn't do any, and then we have a range coming up. And what you can see is there's far more efficiency by having those initial measurements to screen out. So we're seeing the late stage, so genomic testing, the yearling rams, is far more efficient because you've got some more information. There's genetic correlations between traits, and yeah, so you're making more efficient sorting decisions. So if we have a look at the percentage of maximum benefit, we can see that if you test 100% of your selection candidates, you get 100% of the benefit. If you test 0, you get 0 of it. So what we can see is in the late, when we genomic test the yearlings, we can see this old 20-80 rule. And who's heard of that being bandied around through the industry over the last few years? That's where that comes from. But it only applies when we have that initial information in our selection candidates. So to me, I think a 30-90 rule looks the sweetest spot, but that's a personal preference. So we'll add in another few scenarios. So that was genotyping on RAM selection candidates only. Let's forget about the RAMs. Who's thought about genotyping their ewes in their flock in here? A few? So basically what we'll go through is, so we've got genomic testing on ewe candidates only. So we're genomic testing yearlings for natural matings only. Scenario 4 is, again, genomic testing yearlings, but all the lambs are born via embryo transfer, mowat matings. So there's 4 lambs born per ewe, so 125 ewes are needed. And finally, we have GIVIT, juvenile IVF. And what we're assuming there is they're having 8 live lambs per donor ewe, so 62 donor ewes are needed a year. And we need to do early genomic selection on that, so back to a parent average, because they're juveniles. They don't have time to get an initial measurement. So here's familiar, we've got the rams, and what we're going to do is we're going to add in these extra 3. So there's going to be a few extra lines pop up here. And what we have here is the black, is natural mating for ewes, and we can see that we're not getting a whole lot of extra benefit for genotyping all those ewes because they're only having 1 or 2 lambs. They're not getting, don't have as big an impact as the rams who are having 50 to 100. I'll try and come over here for the neglected ones over here, sorry. And so the yellow line is mowat, and if we have no genotyping, we can actually see that mowat is more beneficial than GIVIT. So little side story is you'd never do GIVIT without genotyping. But we can see that GIVIT quickly overtakes mowat because we're significantly lowering the generation interval while having decent, or having some selection accuracy via genomic testing. So what does that look like as a, and just remembering that, I've already covered that, don't worry about that. So what's the percentage of maximum benefit look like versus the proportion of genotyped rams, well not rams, genotyped individuals. So we have that familiar, and we'll add in some extra lines. And you can see to get 80% of the benefit of the ewes, which gives you very little benefit anyway, you've got to do, what's that, 70% of them. So it's starting to look quite inefficient. But if we look at the mowat and GIVIT, we're starting to see that, you know, you've got to do somewhere between 35 and 45%. But I realise that, you know, you're not going to, this is assuming a 500 head nucleus, and you're not going to have 500 lambs born by a mowat or GIVIT every year. So, but the key message is with that is if you were even going to do 10 mowat or GIVIT ewes, you would still try and genotype 35 or 45 of the potential selection candidates to sort of maximise the genetic gain you're going to get from your mowat or GIVIT program. So what's the best value for money here? So we're investing all the money in pedigree, phenotyping, genotyping. And as I said, it's pretty unrealistic to assume that we're going to get a lot of moat and jivet, but let's just say we are. This is the genetic gain you're going to get. So you've got to invest a lot of money to get up over what you would if you're genotyping just your rams. So let's just use the 20% genotyping, because that's what you're very familiar with. And we're assuming that the cost of pedigreeing and phenotyping these traits is $15 and genotyping is $50. And then we're assuming in the reproduction, a jivet lamb will cost you $110 and a mullet lamb will cost you $130. And that's taking in cost of hormones and professional services and wasted recips and all the rest of it. So the overall cost of the breeding programs, well, here in the 3 natural mating programs, it's about $10,000. So we're assuming that we're genotyping 20%, which would be 50 rams or 50 ewes, which is $2,500. But we can see there's significant costs there associated with mullet and jivet programs. So quite clearly, I think the green line would suit a lot of people the best because it's quite a small investment for the benefit that you get. That's why I put a little star there that you can't see. So just to sum up, we go back to the start. Measuring NLW will give a major trait and index response, but that if you get any extra information on a trait in your breeding objective that has heavy weighting, then you will start to see good responses. And the genotyping, as we keep on hearing, it provides more variation for the hard to measure traits, which allows for that potential for greater improvement. The old 20/80 rule applies only if you have some initial information in your ASBVs. And I think the genotyping rams gives you your best bang for your buck. So, is there any questions?
Yeah, Tom, what's the turnaround time for this testing?
At the moment, it's about from the point that you submit to the time they're back in, is about 10 to 12 weeks, I believe. They've got to get sent off to the US and come back. I think that's right, is it? Daniel? Yeah. 10 to 12, yeah. So if you're doing a jivet program, you've got to be extremely organised.
So Tom, what do you think is, for the people in the room that are considering eating quality or even later in life traits, what do you think from here is something that they should really consider?
Well, I think it's a bit of a looking into the crystal ball, because genetics doesn't happen overnight, doesn't happen in 1 year. So I guess you know, if people are looking to, if people think that eating quality is going to be important, these eating quality indexes that have been developed, as Andrew showed, you'll still get, if you adopt those selection indexes, you'll still make gains in the traits that are important at the moment, but you'll start to see improvement into the eating quality, and then obviously you'll be able to make greater gains if you're looking to invest in genomic technologies. But at the end of the day, it's the breeder's choice. You need to decide which way you want to go and which way you think industry's going to move, and what you've been doing for the last since you ever began. So, but it seems pretty clear that eating quality is on the agenda at supermarket level or meat processor level. So, if I was a producer, I'd be seriously looking at you know, moving into those. Yeah.